This London derby ended 2-2, keeping things insanely tight at the top of the table, thanks to Palmer and Mudryk for Chelsea and Rice and Trossard for Arsenal. But what tactics were on display from both sides? And what were the fascinating ways Arteta changed his midfield when he saw things going wrong? Let's take a look, starting with Arsenal in possession as they had more of the ball. Chelsea's shape was an unexpected 4-4-2, with Sterling out wide and Palmer and Gallagher leading the charge up front. And due to the presence of Chelsea's front two, Arsenal did not want their centre-backs to be pressured man-to-man, so they had to always ensure that they had the man advantage. In deeper scenarios, this could be through Raya pushing up from goalkeeper in order to effectively be the third centre-back. In these situations, White would then have the scope either to stay deep and wide or push higher up the pitch. In open play, things were more varied however, as at times we did see White splitting the centre-backs in order to be the third man. However, for the majority of the game, it was White who from right back would tuck in to be the third centre-back, once again ensuring they had that 3 versus 2 advantage. Having White tuck in also gave Arsenal the freedom they love with Zinchenko. At times, this would mean Zinchenko could stay wide and push higher up the pitch, whilst Martinelli could tuck into the half space, as both Jorginho and Rice are well accustomed to playing as a single or double pivot. And with Odegaard pushing high up into the right-hand half space, Arsenal would have a midfield box. But as we know, Arteta loves Zinchenko to tuck in to be the second pivot alongside Jorginho instead. And this has the advantage of keeping Martinelli in his natural wider position, which is advantageous because he is much more of a threat on the ball. He is more likely to pull the fullback into wide regions, growing this space between the centre-back and the fullback. And Rice, who pushes up when Zinchenko is the inverted fullback, has the running power to consistently be a threat when he makes this movement between the fullback and centre-back. Either way, the bottom line would be that Arsenal had their midfield box as they prefer. This midfield box is usually enough to overload the opposition's midfield, particularly a double pivot like Chelsea operated with. However, Pochettino is a wily operator, so of course he had anticipated this shape from Arsenal. And his 4-4-2 wasn't really a traditional 4-4-2, as both Palmer and Gallagher were much more reserved in the defensive phase, and at times even Mudryk and Sterling would be in advance of them. So the midfield was primarily man-to-man, as Chelsea had responded with their own midfield box. Particularly as they had gone ahead so early, Chelsea could afford to be much more passive, with the front two not really looking to press, as shown by the passes per defensive action. This protection of the midfield could be backed up by Chelsea's wingers in Mudryk and Sterling, who would also often tuck in fairly narrow in order to cut off the passing lanes into the men in the half spaces and prevent the midfielders being dragged wide as they looked to cover the space. But Arsenal had a few ways they tried to solve this puzzle. Deeper in the midfield, Caicedo and Enzo were much more man-to-man against Odegaard and Rice in the half spaces. However, Gallagher and Palmer at times were more concerned with protecting the central zone and preventing the play into the midfield. So one adaptation Arsenal had was staggering their midfield, with one man deeper and the other in advance of them. Because the primary concern for Gallagher and Palmer was preventing the central play, it wouldn't be a case of simply staggering their forwards as well, as they often looked to cut out the deepest pivot to prevent that initial press. So we often saw scenarios like this, where both forwards were attracted to a single pivot. What this could now mean, particularly when Jorginho was the higher pivot, is that when he received, he could draw Enzo higher away from Odegaard, creating temporary space to potentially receive beyond Chelsea's midfield. But in most scenarios, Chelsea were able to cover with the centre-back pushing high, or Arsenal simply being unable to find the pass quick enough. What we also saw at times was that Jesus or Martinelli, if the two had dropped, were able to drop into the midfield fairly unchallenged because Enzo and Caicedo were more man-to-man as discussed, so they could receive in these zones. However, neither forward was able to turn consistently and play in men higher up the pitch. And this was because, surprisingly, there weren't a lot of offensive runs from the wingers from out to in these scenarios where the forward had dropped deeper. This meant that Colwell in particular could be more aggressive in closing down his man, knowing that there wasn't as much danger of a winger running into the space created. And this lack of runners in behind at crucial moments was a common theme for Arsenal in this match. So what this meant is that Arsenal were struggling to penetrate, and on the transition their shape left them vulnerable, particularly behind Zinchenko as he had tucked in. So we often saw Chelsea looking dangerous on the transition, and both Gallagher and Palmer would opportunistically drop in to receive the first pass on the transition. And Sterling, when defending, didn't tend to be too deep, but rather hang higher up the pitch. So he was often well positioned to receive a pass and isolate a defender, supported closely by Palmer, leading to some dangerous scenarios. But this is where we once again saw why Arteta is shaping up to be a top manager, as his in-game adaptations were crucial. Seeing that Chelsea were man-to-man with his midfield box, he adapted the shape, directed by the movements of White, Jorginho, and Saka. The centre-backs were seeing most of the ball because the front two were so passive. So instead of having White here, Jorginho began to drop into the right centre-back position, allowing White to push higher up and wider on that right-hand side. And when Jorginho was on the ball in the deeper centre-back position, he had much more gravity than White did on the ball. Gravity meaning he just drew more players towards him, due to his more dangerous passing range in comparison to White. This would often be in the form of either Gallagher, Enzo, or Mudryk being drawn towards him. But as discussed, Gallagher and Palmer were often protecting the centre, so both men could still be preoccupied with a single pivot. But crucially, having White wide meant that Saka could now tuck in, and Odegaard moved in more central, so that now Arsenal had a 3-4-3 with a diamond in the midfield rather than a box. This would now mean that the double pivot of Enzo and Caicedo were outnumbered 3 versus 2. So if Jorginho was able to draw Enzo, Saka would be able to receive in this zone. And where before the centre-backs could freely press without worrying about a runner in behind when Jesus and Martinelli were the ones dropping deeper, now, having a midfielder receive meant that a forward was still in a dangerous position, so when the centre-back jumped, it still was a dangerous scenario. However, Colwell and Silva dealt with these situations well, pressing before the midfielder had the chance to turn. And minimizing the danger. And now having both fullbacks in White and Zinchenko, or Tomiyasu when he came on, made Arsenal look even more vulnerable on the break, as Jorginho does not have the pace of White. So where before it was mainly Sterling to worry about on the transition, now Mudryk was also a danger, flying down the left-hand side, attacking the space behind White. And we did see this lead to a fortunate goal for Chelsea. And we'll briefly touch on Chelsea on the ball, although they were less of a threat in controlled possession, as going ahead so early allowed them to be much more conservative on and off the ball, as shown by that low passes per defensive action. And that defense was working fairly well until Sanchez's error. But generally, Arsenal were much more aggressive in the press, with Odegaard joining Jesus as they shifted into a 4-4-2 when they were looking to press. And whenever the ball would work its way wide, once again they continued their more man-to-man orientation with the winger on the fullback. But due to this 2 versus 2 situation, we often saw Cucurella push higher up on the left-hand side, whilst Gusto would tuck in to be the right centre-back, trying to make it more of a 3 versus 2. And with the forwards pressing so efficiently, we often saw Enzo looking to drop more into this left-back position. However, Saka was effective at closing him down, meaning that Enzo, who is a dangerous progressive option for Chelsea, wouldn't get as much time on the ball. And especially when on the ball, we did see the wingers often operating in advance of the front two, and both Gallagher, but Palmer in particular, would drop into the midfield from time to time to try and make it a 3 versus 2 due to Arsenal's 4-4-2 shape, and Palmer in particular often got into dangerous positions and used his ball carrying ability to push higher up the pitch. But when they did get higher up, there wasn't much offensive threat. And in fact, despite both sides conceding 2, they were both mainly solid defensively, and it was just shaky goalkeeping and a penalty that undid them. Overall, Chelsea will be bitterly disappointed by the manner of the draw, but would have taken the scoreline before the match. For the manager tactical scores, neither side was an offensive threat, but both looked good defensively. So both managers earn a 6. If you enjoyed this video, you'll love this in-depth look at how Jose Mourinho toppled the greatest side in club football history. Linked on screen now. And also check out my Patreon to help support the channel and get early access to new content.